Today we're going to talk about models to guide implementation and sustainability of evidence-based practice. The learning objectives for today are to describe the types of evidence-based models that guide implementation and sustainability of evidence-based practice. We'll discuss how these models can improve healthcare quality and outcomes. We'll critique several of the evidence-based practice models, and then students will be able to create an infographic of how the Iowa model of evidence-based practice can be utilized for project implementation. So the importance of models is founded on the fact that we know healthcare providers are highly motivated to be evidence-based practitioners, but there are individual and organizational barriers that create the need to have a framework for implementation. We've talked in class about the individual barriers of implementation of evidence-based practice, things like the skills in searching literature, critically appraising the literature, a lack of confidence to implement change, and then the perception of time in making those changes. Organizational factors often create the most significant barriers to evidence-based practice, though. The lack of interest, motivation, leadership, vision, strategy, and direction among managers for evidence-based practice poses a significant barrier. In fact, in your textbook, it talks about a random sample of nurses across the United States who identified nurse leaders and managers as a major barrier to evidence-based practice implementation. This could be because a change in practice might involve purchasing new equipment, a policy, or a practice change, and these things require administrative support. Changing clinical practice is complex and challenging, and as a result, models have been developed to systematically guide implementation of evidence-based practice changes. So in the past, research utilization was the term used for moving research into the clinical practice setting. But we know that evidence-based practice is more than just utilizing research. Remember, it's that three-legged stool of best research available, clinician expertise, and patient values and preferences. So increasing recognition that efforts to change practice should be guided by a model or a conceptual framework has happened. I know conceptual models and frameworks isn't something that student nurses think about all the time. And so as a reminder, I've put this slide in here. So a research framework is an abstract and logical structure of meaning. The framework here is being used to describe the concepts and relationships in a study. So a model or a framework explain a theory and they show the relationships of variables to create that logical structure of meaning. These can be expressed as a diagram or an infographic showing the relationships. So I put an example here. So wound healing is my end goal on this slide. And cardiac output and blood sugar both influence wound healing. So I set the infographic up on the slide here with those two components playing into wound healing. You'll notice, though, that there's no relationship between cardiac output and blood sugar, so there's no lines connecting those two things. So basically, this is just a picture of what the infographic would look like. So evidence-based practice models organize thinking about evidence-based practice. They show the relationship of the various aspects and how those work together to improve care and outcomes. Models guide and design implementation and guide practitioners to implement evidence-based practice into practice. Chapter 14 discusses the models in depth, but you can also utilize the article that I posted on the weekly module. The article summarizes each of the models, but also the level of healthcare delivery for model utilization. It talks about who the potential users of the model would be and then the stages of implementation in the model. Most of the evidence-based practice models are grouped into three categories. One would be an evidence-based practice or research utilization and knowledge transformation process. Another grouping could be strategic or organizational change theory to promote uptake and adoption of new knowledge. And the final way models can be grouped is a knowledge exchange and synthesis for application and inquiry. They called it a mapping of the field. There are commonalities between all of the evidence-based practice models. All the models ask you to identify a problem and stakeholders. Find a practice change that's been effective using high-quality research, and then to identify and address potential barriers. Another commonality in the models is that each of them use strategies to disseminate information about the change to willing participants. They talk about implementing, evaluating the change, and then identifying activities to sustain the change. So clearly identifying and defining the relationship between evidence-based practice and critical thinking should occur. We know that evidence-based practice promotes safe care, effective cost-saving measures, and improves outcomes. But there can be problems when applying frameworks. So according to your article, a critical thinker is an individual who is inquisitive, fair-minded, flexible, diligent, and focused on inquiry. And they obtained this information from Giancarlo and Facioni. That was written in 2001. So a nurse utilizing an evidence-based practice model or framework has to be able to apply the components of critical thinking. And those components are analysis, judgment, evaluation, and open-mindedness. If nurses can't do this, they're going to run into these framework problems. So we could use an inappropriate framework. An example would be using an organizational model for a community-based project or for an individual-based project. A disconnected framework, multiple frameworks, so not staying true to that one, or an unidentified framework. And so I have the pictures there of frameworks that are mismatched, right? And so the problem with that is that you won't be able to move your project forward effectively if you're using an incorrect framework. So evidence-based models exist for clinicians as templates to move research into the clinical setting. Once the clinical question is developed, one should conduct and synthesize a review of the literature, create the project, and then utilize a framework for moving it forward. So this best practice pearl is that just talks about the fact that we have to have theory and understanding of how to do a procedure before we do it. And so really using evidence-based practice without a model to move you forward is important. Most of the organizations that have evidence-based practice committees have an organizational framework that they use. In healthcare and in education, evidence-based practice is driven using the ARC model, and that's discussed in your chapter as well. I'll post the next video about the specific evidence-based practice models for you.